Tonight we wander into a hillside soaked in silver moonlight, where the grass is slick with dew and the night hums faintly with insects. Around you shuffle woolly bodies, an entire flock of sheep moving as one, their soft bleats floating like broken lullabies through the cool Celtic air. You catch the smell too, a mixture of lanolin and damp soil, sharp enough to remind you that this isn't some postcard farm. This is survival, centuries ago, where every sheep was wealth, warmth, and maybe tomorrow's dinner. And right there in the middle of it all is a druid, standing straight as an oak, counting each fuzzy form aloud. You lean in, trying not to laugh at the sheer seriousness with which this grown adult is whispering numbers like a child keeping tally of cookies. But in this world, you quickly realise the act of counting sheep isn't a joke, it's life, ritual, and something suspiciously close to religion. You probably won't survive this, of course. If you time-travelled back into this pasture with your sneakers and Wi-Fi addiction, you'd last about half a day before hunger, rain, or some half-wild chieftain with a rusty sword decided you'd make excellent practice for his warriors. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and the local time in the comments. It's always fun to see this little flock of listeners spread across the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge along the ridge, your sandals, or what pass for sandals, sinking into spongy turf. The druid beside you doesn't speak at first. He's busy murmuring numbers. You catch fragments, 3, then 9, then some twist of syllables that doesn't sound like a number at all, but more like a spell. This was the odd magic of the Celts. Numbers were never just math. Each was tied to memory, to story, to the shape of the universe. Sheep were the perfect wriggling abacus. Imagine trying to keep count of the stars while staring into the heavens. They slip and blur. But sheep, they bleat, they bunch, they move with deliberate slowness. And if you lose track, one missing means something very real and very costly. Historically, we know sheep were central to the Celtic economy. Wool was their linen, their cash crop, their trade ticket with Rome itself. To count sheep was to count coins, to measure not just tonight's head count, but tomorrow's fortunes. And here's the quirky tidbit. In some Celtic dialects, the counting system for sheep preserved older, almost prehistoric numbers. Linguists call them sheep-counting numerals. They don't match the usual Indo-European words you'd expect, which has led some scholars to suggest the practice preserved echoes of a forgotten tongue, one older than Celtic itself. Historians still argue whether these counts were genuine survival of a proto-language, or just farmers being stubbornly poetic when it came to their flocks. You stand there listening, realizing how hypnotic it becomes. 1, 2, 3. The rhythm is steady, the numbers like drum beats. You feel your own mind slip a little, lulled by repetition. No Netflix algorithm has ever replicated the trance of sheep counting. You start to get why people might have linked this act to visions. Perhaps in the steady count, the Druids believed the mind brushed against the order of the cosmos, or maybe they just needed to make sure nobody was stealing mutton on the sly. Somewhere nearby a dog barks, an early sheepdog, wiry, lean, already indispensable. The Druid taps his staff into the ground as though sealing the count into the earth itself. That staff, notched and carved, is both a walking stick and a proto-spreadsheet. He'll remember tonight's tally tomorrow and the next day, because memory itself was sacred. The Celts prided themselves on holding knowledge in the mind and not on scrolls. To count sheep was to rehearse numbers, rhythms, cosmology, all woven together. And as you gaze at the flock, you realise you're doing it too. You're counting. Each round body, each shifting shadow you tick off in your head, not because you need to, but because it's impossible not to. The act is strangely soothing, strangely human. Maybe that's why even today we tell kids to count sheep as they fall asleep. It's not just a silly bedtime trick, it's a ghost of Druid hillsides echoing across millennia. You shuffle down from the ridge into the valley, where the flock thickens, a woolly tide brushing against your legs. The Druid pauses his muttered numbers and fixes you with a knowing glance, as if daring you to realise that sheep here aren't just animals, they are currency. You're not looking at dinner, you're looking at a walking purse, a jingling pocket of wool and mutton on hooves. In Celtic society, wealth wasn't measured by coins stamped with Caesar's profile, but by how many sheep bleated under your care. The more you had, the richer you were, the higher your status, the warmer your winters. Forget cryptocurrency, this is sheep coin and it's very, very tangible. You reach out and touch one of the animals. Its fleece feels oily, lanolin coating your fingers like some prehistoric hand lotion. That grease was no accident. Wool spun and dyed clothed an entire culture. A noble's cloak wasn't just warm, it was a statement piece, a billboard of prosperity. And the Druid counting them? He wasn't just making sure none wandered off, he was verifying the tribe's bank balance. Imagine walking into a board meeting and instead of opening spreadsheets, everyone just started herding sheep into a circle and ticking them off one by one. That was the Celtic audit. Mainstream history reminds us that across Iron Age Europe, livestock functioned as living treasure. Cattle often hogged the headlines, but in the wetter, hillier Celtic regions, sheep reigned supreme. They grazed in lands too rough for ploughs and gave back in fleece, milk and meat. And here's the quirky side note. Legal texts from medieval Ireland, descendants of earlier oral traditions, list fines and compensations not in coins but in exact numbers of sheep. Accidentally injure someone? That'll cost you 3 ewes and a ram. It's hard not to picture Celtic lawyers with wool stuck between their teeth. Historians still argue whether these legal codes were purely practical, livestock as units of exchange, or whether something more spiritual lingered beneath. Because when a Druid counts sheep aloud, it doesn't feel purely financial. It feels like ritual, as though each animal in Balsashi is a portion of cosmic order. You can almost hear the undertone, one sheep equals not just food but a sliver of balance, one life weighed against another in the great scales of nature. The Druid taps his staff again and the sheep shuffle in a rough spiral around him. You realise you're standing in a mobile mint, one that breathes and bleats and occasionally eats your shoelaces. The Druid murmurs a phrase you don't quite catch. It's half number, half prayer. Maybe he's ensuring not just the flock's survival, but the tribe's prosperity. The flow of goods to and from far-off markets where Roman merchants haggle for wool cloaks. You can almost imagine one such trader snorting at the Celtic method. You call that bookkeeping? And the Druid replying, deadpan, better than your tiny bronze coins, friend. Try sleeping under one of those. You glance at the horizon, where smoke curls up from a settlement. Inside those huts, families dream of sheep the way modern folks dream of fat paychecks. Children grow up hearing the count like a lullaby, internalizing the truth that each number isn't just a sound, it's survival. The flock before you isn't a random herd, it's an investment portfolio, carefully diversified across breeds, ages, and fleece colours. Each sheep is literally counted because each sheep literally counts. And here's a little wink from history. In parts of Wales and northern England, counting sheep out loud in old Celtic-derived number systems survived well into the 19th century. Farmers would mutter odd-sounding words, yan, tan, tethera, as they tallied their animals. Kids picked it up too, sometimes using it in playground rhymes long after sheep had left their daily lives. To outsiders it sounded like gibberish, To insiders, it was a living fossil of a time when your family's fate was spelled out in woolly arithmetic. As you step back, one ram locks eyes with you, chewing lazily. You wonder if he knows he's essentially a coin purse on legs. Probably not, but the druid knows. Every count is a calculation, every number a reminder that survival here is not measured in gold or silver, but in the bleating chorus of the valley. You trail after the druid as the flock drifts toward a shallow stream, hooves squelching in the mud. He raises a hand, pauses, and resumes his chant, numbers slipping off his tongue with the weight of ritual. It strikes you suddenly. He's not just tallying sheep. He's performing something closer to a liturgy. In Celtic thought, precision mattered. To miscount wasn't simply sloppy accounting. It risked unbalancing the invisible fabric of the world. Each sheep represented not just wealth, but a unit of order, and in saying the numbers, the druid realigned tribe, cosmos, and pasture. You crouch beside the water, noticing how the moonlight makes ripples look like silver threads weaving through the grass. The sheep file across one by one, and with each crossing, the druid's voice deepens. You realize he's tying the moment to ritual precision. 1 means a sheep has crossed safely, 2 binds the flock tighter to the tribe, 3 locks both sheep and humans into the triadic rhythm the Celts loved so much. Precision becomes sacred. It isn't enough to say lots of sheep. You must declare the exact number, or else the universe hears only chaos. Mainstream historical fact, Celtic Druids were famed for memorizing vast amounts of lore, and astronomy without writing it down. Their reputations as human encyclopedias weren't just for fun. In a society without ledgers or scrolls, memory was law. And here's the quirky tidbit. Archaeological evidence shows tally sticks, wooden staffs with notches, were used across early Europe to keep precise counts of animals or debts. Some scholars wonder if druids treated these notched staves as half mathematical, half magical tools, where each cut represented not just arithmetic but destiny. Historians still argue whether druids deliberately blurred the line between math and magic, or whether later romantic writers exaggerated the mystique. The druid beside you looks like Exhibit A for the magical theory. His every count sounds heavy, deliberate, like a spoken charm. He leans on his staff as though each notch carved into the wood is humming quietly. You sense that the sheep themselves become steadier under the weight of this ritual, less prone to scatter, more likely to fall in line. Maybe that's practical animal psychology. Maybe it's enchantment. Out here in the mist, you're not sure there's a difference. You chuckle softly. Imagine trying this in modern life. Your boss gathers everyone for the quarterly report, but instead of charts, she stares gravely at a group of office chairs and recites numbers until you all feel hypnotized. That's the druid's gift, making something as dull as arithmetic pulse with cosmic tension. The sheep keep coming, their wool brushing against your knees. You hear the rhythm, ba, squelch, number, ba, squelch, number. It starts to feel like percussion, like the flock itself is drumming to the cadence of the chant. You catch yourself thinking, maybe precision is less about control and more about trance. By counting exactly, you tether the mind to something external, shutting out stray thoughts. You fall into rhythm with the druid, whispering numbers under your breath. Suddenly the cold air feels warmer, the night less sharp. You've slipped into the very ritual that's lulled countless Celts across centuries. The druid finally rests his staff against the ground, exhaling. The last sheep has crossed. He nods satisfied. For him, precision has been honoured. For you, it's been a lesson. Counting isn't only arithmetic, it's communion. Sheep become units of sacred math, and math itself becomes prayer. The flock settles on the far side of the stream, a fuzzy constellation of white and grey scattered across the hillside. You notice how the druid doesn't just stop once the count is finished. He lingers, murmuring small phrases as though aligning the numbers with something beyond the flock. Then it dawns on you. For these druids, counting sheep was never isolated from the wider universe. Every number resonated with cycles of the moon, the march of the sun, and those oddly sacred numbers, 3, 7, 9, that keep showing up in Celtic myth like recurring background characters in a TV show. You tilt your head back and look up at the night sky. Stars crowd the heavens, far more visible than you ever get through modern light pollution. The druid points with his staff, drawing a line from the 3 brightest stars of Orion's belt to the sheep huddled below. It's no coincidence. Triads, triplets, threes. Celts adored this number. 1 sheep is survival, 2 is companionship, 3 is completion. When the druid hits that 3rd tally, he isn't just saying 3 sheep, he's declaring that the cosmic pattern has been met. Mainstream history tells us that Celtic cosmology leaned heavily on numerical symbolism. 3s dominate the 3 realms of land, sea and sky. The triple goddess in various guises, even the Triskel symbol carved into stones and jewellery. And here's the quirky tidbit. Some old sheep counting rhymes don't bother with 4, 5, 6 in the way you'd expect. They skip or bend numbers to land more often on magic counts like 3 or 9. Historians still argue whether this was pure superstition or a deliberate mnemonic device to keep the rhythm catchy while herding. You squint again at the stars. The druid's hand sweeps to 9 faint points in the Pleiades, then dips to the flock, as if suggesting that each cluster of sheep mirrors a heavenly cluster above. Sheep are stand-ins for stars, and stars in turn are celestial sheep tended by gods. To count sheep, then, is to practice astronomy on a smaller, fluffier scale. A flock becomes a woolly model of the sky, one you can prod, herd and rearrange until it makes sense. The druid's lips move with numbers that sound less like math homework and more like incantation. He emphasizes certain syllables, stretching them out the way a priest might linger over a psalm. You begin to feel the weight of each of you, not just as quantity but as symbol. 7 isn't 7 sheep, it's the 7 stages of life. 9 isn't 9 lambs, it's the 9 hazel trees of wisdom in Irish legend. And because you can't resist the walkies, pulses, your mind drifts to a modern parallel. Imagine trying to explain this to an accountant. Sorry, I can't close your books yet. I need to check if the number of office chairs matches the constellation of Orion. Yet here, in this moonlit pasture, it makes perfect sense. Every sheep bleat is an echo of a star's shine, every tally an attempt to stitch human survival into the fabric of the cosmos. The sheep themselves seem blissfully unaware of their astronomical duties, chewing grass with blank stares. But the druid keeps at it, shoulders squared, voice steady. To him this is serious work. Counting sheep is not just management, it's cosmology. A way to guarantee that tribe, flock, and stars stay in sync. And as you stand beneath that vast Celtic sky, you feel a little tug in your chest. The strange sense that numbers are more than human inventions. They might just be the universe whispering back. The night mist curls low, wrapping your ankles in damp ribbons as you follow the druid deeper into the pasture. His lips keep moving even when there are no more sheep directly before him. You lean closer and realise he's repeating numbers under his breath, almost like a mantra. This is no idle habit. It's training. In a culture where nothing is written down, memory itself becomes survival. And counting sheep, you discover, isn't just for keeping track of woolly assets. It's a mental old gym, a way to flex the muscles of oral tradition. Picture the druid in training, a teenager with hair still wild from the last rainstorm. His teacher sets him in the fields and orders, "Count every sheep, no mistakes." He does. Then the teacher says, "Now do it backward." Then, "Now start at 3 and skip every 4th sheep." By the time the boy collapses in the grass, his brain has stretched like dough, kneaded into something pliable and strong. What looks like sheep counting is actually mnemonic boot camp. Mainstream history supports this. Classical writers like Julius Caesar commented that druids memorized staggering amounts of lore, astronomy and poetry, deliberately avoiding writing so their knowledge would live only in human minds. And here's the quirky tidbit. In certain pockets of Borean, sheep counting preserved tally words so ancient that modern linguists suspect they were remnants of pre-Celtic languages. Counting sheep literally kept fragments of lost tongues alive for millennia. Historians still argue whether these number words were once everyday speech or invented purely as counting devices, half poetry, half math. The druid staff scratches a line in the dirt, each mark corresponding to a cluster of sheep. He doesn't look down at it, he looks up, eyes half-lidded, reciting the count again. You notice how the rhythm shifts, sometimes fast, sometimes slow, as if he's setting it to an invisible beat. It reminds you of rap battles or slam poetry, a performance where flow is everything, and the numbers themselves are less important than the cadence that carries them. You try it yourself. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Your voice drones on, and sure enough, your mind starts to blur. The steady repetition dulls your edges, like waves scraping sand smooth. You can almost see why counting sheep became the go-to sleep aid. What's happening in your brain is a mild trance, the kind druids may have cultivated deliberately. Instead of scrolling endlessly on your phone, sorry, no Wi-Fi in the Iron Age, you repeat numbers until your inner noise quiets. The druid chuckles when you nearly trip over a tuft of grass. "Memory," he seems to say. Though you can't be sure, the point is clear. By counting sheep, he's not just safeguarding wool. He's rehearsing stories, laws, cosmologies that stretch for hours, even for days, when recited at festivals. Every tally is a peg in the vast wall of oral tradition. Forget a sheep and you risk forgetting a law. Miscount and maybe you misremember a lineage. The stakes aren't just pastoral, they're cultural. You think about how odd it is that something as humble as sheep became the foundation of mental discipline. No libraries, no scrolls, just flocks and memory. And while the sheep chew cud without concern, the druid uses them as living textbooks. He doesn't just count, he remembers. And by remembering, he keeps the tribe's wisdom alive, each bleat punctuating the cadence of knowledge passed from one mouth to another. A sudden rustle in the brush sends the ripple through the flock, sheep crowding closer together with uneasy bleats. The druid stiffens, staff pressed into the soil. His counting grows sharper, faster, as though the numbers themselves could push back whatever lurks beyond the mist. You catch sight of a shadow slipping between the trees, a wolf maybe, or just your imagination. But here's the truth. In Celtic pastures, threats were everywhere. Counting sheep wasn't simply about knowing how many you owned. It was about making sure none had been swallowed by teeth or stolen by hands, whether human or not so human. You shuffle closer to the druid. His voice takes on a tone that reminds you of a parent checking on children before bed. Present, protective, firm. Each number feels like a roll call. The act of counting transforms into a defense against absence. If you reached 37 yesterday, but only 36 tonight, then something has gone wrong. Maybe it's a thief from a rival tribe creeping in under cover of darkness. Maybe it's a wolf dragging one into the woods. Or maybe, and here's where Celtic imagination stretches wider, it's the fair folk, the otherworldly being said to snatch sheep just to prove that humans didn't fully own what grazed on sacred land. Mainstream historical fact. Raiding livestock was one of the most common forms of warfare among Celtic tribes. Wealth was mobile after all. You couldn't torch someone's coins, but you could drive off their herds in a single night. And here's the quirky tidbit. Certain folk traditions in Ireland warned shepherds never to count sheep out loud after dark, because the fairies might hear and claim one for themselves. Historians still argue whether such warnings came from genuine belief or were simply clever ways to scare children into guarding the flock properly. The Druid doesn't hesitate. He continues to count, pressing the numbers into the air like a ward. Each spoken word seems to weave a fence higher than any wooden palisade. You notice the sheep calming, their ears flicking less, their bleats settling into softer murmurs. It's as if they too understand that numbers have weight, that the voice of the Druid is a shield. You think of modern security systems, cameras, locks, sensors. Back then all they had was presence, memory and voice. Counting sheep was the Iron Age version of checking the locks before bed. You whisper to yourself 1, 2, 3, and even you feel oddly safer. The shadow in the trees doesn't return. Maybe it was never there. The Druid finally exhales, drawing the staff in a circle around his feet as though sealing the ritual. He gives you a look somewhere between relief and smugness, as if to say, "See, numbers work better than swords." You can't help but smile. Maybe he's right. Maybe the act of counting was never just about livestock. It was about imposing order in a world that loved chaos. Wolves, raiders, spirits, all could be kept at bay if you never lost track, if you always knew exactly how many sheep should stand in the moonlight. The Druid leads you uphill again, staff thudding softly against the turf, and as the mist thins, you notice that the wood of his staff isn't plain. It's carved with deep notches running in neat rows. He pauses, running his fingers along them, as though reading a language written only for him. Then it hits you. These aren't just scratches. This staff is a tally stick, a kind of living notebook, where each groove represents a sheep, a transaction, or perhaps even a season gone by. You lean in, counting the notches yourself, but you quickly lose track. Some are deeper, some shorter, and some seem grouped in 3s or 9s. To you it looks like random whistling. To the Druid it's precise bookkeeping. When he presses his thumb into one of the marks, his lips shape the same number he whispered over the flock. This staff is no mere walking stick. It's his portable ledger, his calculator, his memory aid, and perhaps even his wand. Mainstream historical fact, tally sticks were used across Europe well into the Middle Ages, sometimes even by royal treasuries to record debts and payments. The Celts had their own versions much earlier, using bones or wood to notch records. And here's the quirky tidbit. One famous British tally stick, used centuries later, was accidentally burned in the 19th century, causing a fire so catastrophic it destroyed part of the Houses of Parliament. Imagine centuries of sheep counts and debts going up in smoke. Historians still argue whether early Celtic tally sticks were purely practical, or whether Druids imbued them with ritual significance, treating each notch like a charm cut into wood. The Druid lifts the staff high, and the sheep seem to pause, almost acknowledging it. You wonder if they've been trained to recognise the staff as a symbol of order. When it's raised, they gather. When it's lowered, they scatter. Practical herding tool? Maybe. Magical artifact? Equally possible. You picture modern accountants wielding tally sticks instead of spreadsheets. Each client meeting would involve carving grooves into mahogany, muttering numbers and waving the stick around like Gandalf doing taxes. It sounds ridiculous, until you realise it worked. This Druid knows exactly how many sheep belong here, exactly how many seasons he's watched them lamb, and exactly which grooves mark the years of famine or abundance. He shows you a cluster of notches near the middle. You can't decode them, but you sense the gravity in his expression. Maybe those notches mark a year when raiders stole half the flock, or when a disease swept through. Each cut is both history and warning, a reminder carved into wood that memory is fragile unless anchored by touch. When the druid resumes walking, the staff taps like a metronome, each sound echoing the sheep count still hanging in the night air. You find yourself weirdly envious. Your modern phone battery dies after 12 hours, but this stick will outlast him, maybe even outlast the tribe, carrying in its notches the stubborn record of woolly arithmetic. The druid halts on a rise, where the flock gathers in a natural circle, their white backs glinting faintly under the stars. He points his staff toward the sky, then down at the sheep, then back to the sky again. You realise what he's hinting at. This isn't just herd management, it's astronomy disguised in wool. Look closely and you start to see it too. That cluster of lambs nestled together resembles the Pleiades, the seven sisters. A line of rams in the distance mimics Orion's belt. It dawns on you that the druids weren't just counting sheep randomly, they were mapping the heavens onto the earth, using their flocks as stand-in constellations. To count a sheep was to count a star, and by counting stars they kept track of seasons, rituals, and the great wheel of time. Mainstream historical fact: Celtic Druids were known as sky watchers, observing solstices, equinoxes, and lunar cycles with impressive accuracy. Some stone monuments, like Newgrange in Ireland, align perfectly with the winter solstice sunrise, proving their astronomical skill. And here's the quirky tidbit. In parts of rural Britain, shepherds long after the Druids would name their sheep after stars, keeping Orion, Cassiopeia, or the Pleiades alive in everyday farm life. Historians still argue whether Druids deliberately use sheep as astronomy training models for novices, or whether that's a romantic overlay we've added to make pasture work sound cosmic. The druid beckons you closer, arranging 3 sheep deliberately apart from the flock. He speaks a word you don't understand, then gestures upward at Orion's belt. The connection is clear. He's teaching by imitation, using living creatures to mirror the heavens. It's tactile astronomy, the kind you can nudge with your hands and hear bleating in protest. The sky becomes less distant, less abstract. When you move the sheep, you move the stars. You can't help laughing softly. Imagine NASA training its astronomers this way. Alright folks, go outside, line up a few cows and pretend they're Saturn's moons. Yet here it feels profound. These druids turned every pasture into a planetarium, every flock into a star chart with hooves. As the druid continues, he circles the sheep into a spiral, then points at the Milky Way above, a cosmic spiral mirrored in wool. The repetitive counting now makes more sense. By numbering each sheep, he grounds the intangible heavens in something as earthy as livestock. It's both sacred lesson and practical routine. The sheep seem unimpressed, chewing grass with the intensity of animals who don't know they're standing in for constellations. But you see the pattern. Each count, each arrangement ties the human tribe to the sky. And when winter bites, when food is scarce, when raids threaten, that connection reassures them that they're still aligned with the greater order of things. You feel oddly reassured too. For a moment you forget about Wi-Fi signals, grocery stores and electric clocks. Above you, stars, as below you, sheep, and between them stands the druid, stitching sky and earth together with nothing more than numbers. The night deepens, and with it the rhythm of counting slows until it's almost a lullaby. You notice your own eyelids growing heavier, your breaths falling into step with the cadence of the druid's voice. This, you realise, is no accident. Repetition isn't just a tool for tallying, it's a bridge into trance, a way to slip sideways out of ordinary awareness. The druid sits on a flat stone, sheep milling around him in loose clusters. His lips keep moving steady and soft like a metronome for the mind. You sit nearby trying to match his pace. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. The longer you go, the more your thoughts scatter. Worries dissolve, replaced by the simple act of breathing and counting. You almost laugh when you catch yourself nodding off. It turns out the oldest sleep trick in the book really is the oldest sleep trick in the book. Mainstream historical fact: altered states were central to Druidic practice. Classical sources describe them fasting, chanting, and using rhythm to enter trance-like conditions. They didn't call it meditation, but the method sounds familiar. And here's the quirky tidbit. In some rural areas of Britain, shepherds reportedly counted sheep aloud, not just to track them, but to keep themselves awake, or ironically, to lull themselves into a light doze while the flock rested. Historians still argue whether repetitive counting was deliberately used as the spiritual induction method, or whether it simply had that side effect and people built myths around it. The Druid's voice is hypnotic. Each number seems to tug at the edge of your awareness, like waves pulling at sand. The sheep shuffle slowly, their bleats soft and irregular, adding background texture to the chant. You realise that in this trance, the Druid may have claimed visions, glimpses of other worlds where gods and ancestors walked. Counting sheep literally opened doors. The mind, soothed into rhythm, was free to wander into strange landscapes, part dream, part revelation. And you're caught somewhere between wanting to stay awake and wanting to surrender. A joke crosses your mind. Who needs Netflix sleep stories when you've got Iron Age sheep hypnosis? Then the joke dissolves because you feel yourself slipping, lulled by the rhythm. The Druid glances at you, half smiling as if he knows exactly where you're headed. Numbers keep flowing, 35, 36, 37, and your awareness drifts with them. You're not just counting sheep anymore, you're counting breaths, stars, heartbeats, moments. Each number slides into the next until the boundaries blur. You could swear the sheep themselves are moving in slow, synchronized patterns, like dancers in a ritual you're only now beginning to understand. Somewhere, far away, you hear a faint bleat, then silence, then the steady voice of the Druid pulling you back. You blink hard, shake off the trance, and realise with a small grin that you've just experienced what Celts probably did on countless nights, slipping into visions through nothing more than wool, breath, and numbers whispered into the mists. The Druid doesn't stop when the trance fades. His voice rises a little, no longer a sleepy murmur, but something sharper, almost commanding. Each number now feels less like a tally and more like a word of power hurled into the night. You realise you're not just hearing counting, you're hearing spells disguised as arithmetic. In Celtic thought, words weren't neutral. To speak was to shape reality, to push sound into the air and expect it to ripple through both the natural and the unseen worlds. Numbers then doubled as charms. Say 3 firmly enough, and it wasn't just sheep number 3. It was invoking the sacred triad, the endless Celtic obsession with things grouped in 3s. Say 9. And you weren't simply checking off a you were summoning the number that symbolised completion and magical thresholds. Mainstream historical fact. Druids were often described by Roman writers as using verses and chants to perform rituals. Words themselves carried potency, especially when repeated in measured rhythm. And here's the quirky tidbit. In Welsh and Irish counting systems, the words for numbers often rhymed or echoed each other, turning a simple list into something musical. Historians still argue whether those rhymes were designed purely as mnemonics for shepherds, or whether they were deliberate enchantments wrapped in everyday practice. The Druid stands now, staff raised, and calls out a number, 40. The sound rings like a command. The sheep shuffle almost obediently, as though pushed by invisible hands. He doesn't pause, leaping into the next, 41, 42. Each syllable is precise, clipped, deliberate. You feel goosebumps on your arms, as if the air itself, hums in agreement. You imagine how this might have looked to outsiders. A Roman soldier posted on the frontier peers over a hedge and sees a druid in the fog yelling numbers at sheep. He probably burked, muttered something about barbarian nonsense, and went back to sharpening his sword. But to the druid's tribe, those numbers carried weight. They were shields, charms, invocations woven into nightly routine. The idea makes you laugh quietly, sheep as both wool producers and magical catalysts. Imagine your bank account doubling as a spellbook. Every time you check your balance, you're not just verifying funds, you're casting protection charms against overdraft demons. In a way, the druids lived exactly like that. Numbers weren't cold digits, they were alive, charged, and ready to tilt reality if spoken right. The sheep seem calm, drifting into small groups. The druid lowers his staff satisfied, as though the spell has been sealed. You wonder whether he's kept predators away tonight, or simply bound the flock tighter, or maybe even opened some invisible gate to the other world. Whatever the case, the ordinary act of counting has become something extraordinary. A language of numbers that is also a language of magic. You catch yourself whispering along, testing the sound of each count. The numbers feel heavier now, denser, more important. You're not sure whether you're tallying sheep anymore, or whether you're conjuring something. Either way, you sense why the druids took it so seriously. Every spoken number was a spell, and every spell mattered. The druid motions for you to follow him down a slope where the grass thins into trodden earth. The air tastes faintly of smoke, and soon you see why. A circle of fires, low and controlled, flickers in the distance. Beyond them, villagers gather, their voices humming like bees around a hive. The sheep are being herded toward the clearing, and suddenly you realize this isn't just another quiet count in the mist. This is a festival. It must be Beltane, or maybe Lugnasad, the great Celtic celebrations that mark the turning of seasons. Sheep weren't just wealth, they were central to the very rhythm of life. At Beltane, flocks were driven between twin bonfires to purify them and ensure fertility. At Lugnasad, the first harvest, sheep might be offered as tribute or roasted for communal feasts. In either case, the druids' counting was essential not only to ensure the numbers tallied with expectations, but to show the gods that every life was accounted for. Mainstream historical fact, Celtic festivals often revolved around livestock, fertility and harvest cycles, with sheep figuring prominently in rituals tied to prosperity. And here's the quirky tidbit. Some accounts mention shepherds driving sheep through smoke while muttering number rhymes, believing the rhythm itself protected the flock from sickness or ill luck. Historians still argue whether these chants were originally religious or whether they were practical shepherds' routines that festivals simply borrowed and sanctified. The druid's voice rises above the crowd, calling out numbers as the sheep pass through the firelit gateway. Each bleat feels amplified, echoing against drums and pipes. Children squeal, women carry baskets of bread, and men haul skins of ale. You stand transfixed, realizing that the act of counting, the same repetitive tally you've been lulled by all night, is suddenly spectacle. It's no longer private or protective, it's communal, a performance where every villager witnesses the sacred arithmetic of survival. 1, 2, 3. The crowd repeats in unison, almost like a chorus. The rhythm of numbers fuses with the beat of the drums, creating a soundscape halfway between lullaby and battle cry. The sheep, nervous at first, surge forward, their wool catching glimmers of firelight until they move like glowing embers tumbling down the hill. You grin at the absurdity, an entire village chanting sheep numbers as if Beyoncé just took the stage, yet you can't deny the power. Counting here isn't dull bookkeeping. It's theatre, religion, and community building all rolled into one. The druid finishes the count, raises his staff, and the fires roar higher as though responding. You feel the hairs on your neck stand up. To the villagers, the sheep have been purified, the gods appeased, and the future secured. To you, it's a reminder that something as mundane as 4748 could transform into a spellbinding communal ritual. And when the first roasted lamb is carried to the feasting tables, you notice the druid still mumbling numbers under his breath. Even amid laughter and music, he keeps the cosmic tally alive. Because here, every festival begins and ends with sheep counted literally, ritually, and always out loud. The fires die down to glowing coals, and the villagers drift into singing, laughter, and heavy feasting. But at the edge of the circle, where shadows stretch longest, you notice a quieter scene. A bard, harp cradled against his chest, plucking a tune that seems to borrow directly from the counting rhythms you've been hearing all night. You sit beside him, and soon realize he isn't singing random words, he's weaving numbers into verse. It makes sense. Bards, like druids, were masters of memory. To recite genealogies, laws and legends, they needed scaffolding. Rhythms and patterns sturdy enough to hold mountains of knowledge. Sheep counting, with its steady beat and repetitive cadence, offered a perfect foundation. 1, 2, 3, tethera, methera, pimp. The syllables fall naturally into music, like pebbles skipping across a pond. The bard grins when he notices you mouthing along. He knows you're slipping into the same mnemonic spell. Mainstream historical fact, Celtic bards often recited epic poetry lasting hours or even days, sustained entirely by the memory and rhythm. Their performances weren't just entertainment but oral libraries. And here's the quirky tidbit. Sheep counting numerals in northern England and Wales, yan, tan, tethra, survived in nursery rhymes and even counting out games for children. Historians still argue whether those playful echoes were remnants of bardic training tools or simply shepherds' counting systems absorbed into folk culture. The bard leans closer and hums a line, his words falling into 3s, then 9s. Each number blends with images. 3 sheep in a meadow, 3 rivers flowing, 3 sisters dancing. Numbers become poetry, and poetry in turn becomes a form of record keeping. You realise that what the druid chanted in the fields has been reshaped into art. Art that keeps history alive when no parchment or ink can. The sheep, oddly enough, respond too. They graze near the bard as though soothed by the music, heads bobbing in rhythm. You chuckle under your breath. Sheep as both audience and subject. Imagine a pop star today singing only about bank accounts, with the bank accounts themselves humming along in approval. Yet in this world, that's exactly how it works. The bard shifts his tune into a lull, and the villagers nearby quiet just enough to listen. The numbers slip seamlessly into myth. 9 hazels bend over the well of wisdom. 3 bright hounds chase the sun. The sheep count has transformed into the story into song, and the song into memory that might echo for generations. It dawns on you that sheep weren't only counted to keep them safe or to tally wealth. They were counted to create rhythm, and rhythm became the backbone of Celtic art itself. Counting sheep literally shaped music, poetry, and even the way people fell asleep to song. You lean back against the grass, the bard's melody tugging at your own heavy eyelids. Somewhere nearby, the druid still murmurs tallies, but here, beside the bard, you understand, numbers weren't dry recitations, they were verses waiting to be sung. As the night grows heavy with feasting smoke and harp strings fading into the distance, the druid returns to the flock. His face is solemn now, less celebratory than before. You notice villagers gathering around him in a hush, their eyes drawn to a pen of sheep set apart from the rest. These are not for wool or milk or casual counting games. These are offerings. You feel the shift in mood immediately. Sheep counted so carefully in life were also tallied in death. Every sacrifice had to be precise, every number exact, or else the ritual risked losing its potency. To undercount was to offend the gods, To overcount was to unbalance the tribe's fragile relationship with the unseen. So the druid stands tall, staff in hand, calling out each number as the chosen sheep step forward. Mainstream historical fact. Celtic societies practiced animal sacrifice during major festivals, particularly at Beltane and Samhain. Archaeological evidence from bogs and ritual pits often reveals sheep bones alongside cattle. And here's the quirky tidbit. Some Irish legends suggest that if the count of sacrificial animals did not align with sacred numbers like 3, 7, or 9, the offering would be rejected as void. Historians still argue whether this was literal ritual lore or a poetic exaggeration carried forward in later storytelling. The druid intones 1, 2, 3. Each word feels like a nail hammered into cosmic order. Villagers murmur in agreement, some clutching charms, others closing their eyes as though to share the weight of the numbers. You can almost hear the arithmetic of belief. 3 sheep offered means 3 blessings returned, 3 misfortunes avoided, 3 seasons safeguarded. For a moment, you imagine what it must feel like for the druid to hold in your voice not just the tally of sheep, but the balance of the tribe's fate. Each number spoken becomes a thread woven into the god's attention. Miscount once and maybe the gods turn away. Miscount twice and perhaps the harvest falters. You can't help but chuckle nervously. Imagine your grocery store cashier accidentally misscanning an apple and the entire town blaming them for a bad winter. Yet here, that's exactly the gravity. The sheep, for their part, seem unfazed, munching grass as though unaware they stand at the threshold of eternity. Their calmness only heightens the villagers' reverence. To them this isn't grim, it's necessary, a cosmic exchange written in wool and blood counted down to the last bleat. The druid's final number echoes in the clearing, followed by kints. The offering is complete, the tally precise, the tribe reassured. You exhale slowly, realizing that in this world, counting sheep isn't just a sleepy ritual, it's life, death, and the fragile arithmetic of survival. Dawn's first light creeps over the hills, and you find yourself walking with the druid along a rough boundary line where 2 tribes' pastures meet. The air is colder here, tense with the weight of arguments long rehearsed. A rival chieftain waits on the other side, arms folded, flanked by the warriors who eye you as if you've just wandered into the world's most intimidating HOA meeting. The sheep huddle nervously between the groups, blissfully unaware that they are both evidence and bargaining chips. This is where counting sheep turns courtroom drama. The druid steps forward, staff in hand, and begins to recite numbers in a clear, deliberate tone. Each word is proof. This flock belongs to us. The rival counters, insisting some of those sheep were stolen or strayed across the boundary. Voices rise, and suddenly you realize that in the Celtic world, math wasn't confined to dusty chalkboards. It was shouted across valleys to settle disputes that could spark wars. Mainstream historical fact. Early Irish law codes, known as the Brecon Laws, frequently used livestock, sheep, cattle, pigs, as units of measure for fines, compensations, and boundaries. They weren't abstract currency, they were legal tender. And here's the quirky tidbit. Some records mention disputes where sheep counts were witnessed by entire communities, the recited tally carrying as much weight as a signed contract. Historians still argue whether druids were neutral arbiters of these counts, or whether they leaned conveniently toward whichever tribe kept them best fed. The druid beside you counts with absolute precision, touching his staff to each animal as though notarizing them. The rival frowns, mutters, and then begins his own count, using different words for the same numbers. The crowd erupts. Whose counting system is valid? Your head spins. It's like watching 2 lawyers argue over whether the word 4 is legally binding if spoken as 4. Tension rises. A sheep bleats loudly, startling everyone, and you nearly laugh at how a single animal seems to have broken the mood. But the laughter dies quickly. This is serious. If the numbers don't agree, the outcome could mean raids, blood feuds, or worse. The druid finishes with confidence, slamming his staff into the soil to mark the final number. Silence follows. The rival scowls, but cannot refute the tally. For now, the sheep are secured, the border calm. Counting has won where swords might otherwise have clashed. You glance at the flock, plump, oblivious, chewing grass on contested land. Who would have guessed that woolly creatures could serve as legal documents, witnesses, and evidence all in one? In this world, every bleat echoes like a clause in a contract, and every number spoken is a verdict that can hold or break peace. The dispute settles, and the rival tribe drifts away, but the druid lingers by the boundary stone. His staff rests lightly in his hand, his gaze far off, as though he's remembering something older than today's quarrel. He begins murmuring again, not in the crisp, confident tone of courtroom counts, but in a softer, almost mournful rhythm. You lean closer and catch fragments of stories woven into the numbers, tales of sheep lost, flocks vanished, and curses whispered in the dark. It seems every community carried legends about miscounted sheep. One story you're told speaks of a shepherd who skipped a number out of laziness. The next morning, half his flock was gone, swallowed by mist that never lifted. Another tale warns of a woman who counted her lambs too proudly aloud, boasting of her abundance only for the fair folk to steal them overnight as punishment for arrogance. Sheep lost to fey bargains, to wandering lights, to strange disappearances that couldn't be explained. These became warnings wrapped inside bedtime stories, mainstream historical fact, justice. Folk tales across Ireland, Wales and Scotland often feature livestock mysteriously vanishing, sometimes tied to fairy abductions or magical landscapes. The ordinary danger of wolves or thieves was reframed in mythic terms. And here's the quirky tidbit. In parts of the Scottish Highlands, people once believed that if you fell asleep while counting sheep in the open fields, the fairies might snatch you too, pulling you into their otherworld banquets. Historians still argue whether these stories were cautionary tales meant to keep herders alert, or genuine echoes of supernatural beliefs clinging to rural life. The druid's voice slows as he recounts a legend of the 13th sheep, one that never appeared in the tally but always showed up in the meadow. If you counted 12, the next day you'd see 13. If you counted 13, one would vanish. A phantom sheep, a reminder that numbers could slip, reality could warp, and you were never entirely in control. You shiver a little, though the night is mild. There's something haunting in the idea that sheep counting wasn't just practical but perilous. That getting it wrong could invite disaster. To us, losing count is a minor annoyance. To them, it could mean famine, curses, or eternal blame. The druid finally falls silent, eyes heavy with memory. The sheep graze calmly, unaware of the weight carried by their nightly roll call. You can't help but grin, though, at the irony. In modern times, people count sheep to soothe themselves to sleep. Back then, people counted sheep to stay awake, alert and alive, because if you nodded off, you might wake to an empty pasture and a legend whispered about your foolishness for generations. The mist lifts as the sun begins to stain the hills with pale gold. You blink, startled, as the druid gestures for you to follow him not toward the flock, but toward a small stone hut crouched beside a monastery wall. The chanting inside is different now. No flowing Celtic syllables, but the clipped rhythm of Latin prayers. A monk in a rough woolen habit peers out, eyes bright with curiosity, then recognition. He greets the druid like an old friend. And in that moment, you see how old practices never die completely. They just slip into new robes. The monk shows you a parchment, thick and cuff, covered in lines of ink. It's a sheep count, neat as any modern spreadsheet, with rows marking ewes, lambs and rams. But between the columns you notice faint echoes of something older, little marks, groupings in 3s and 9s, as though the writer couldn't help but preserve the druidic rhythm. The act of tallying sheep has survived the leap from pasture to parchment, carrying with it whispers of older magic. Mainstream historical fact: after Christianity spread through Celtic lands, monasteries became centres of record keeping. They meticulously documented tithes and flocks, often counting livestock as part of church wealth. And here's the quirky tidbit. Some medieval account books preserve sheep tallies that look suspiciously like old accounting systems, suggesting monks absorbed druidic habits even as they condemned their pagan roots. Historians still argue whether this continuity was intentional preservation or simply habit carried over from converted shepherds turned scribes. The druid and the monk sit together, murmuring numbers in different tongues, Gaelic here, Latin there, but the cadence is the same. It's as if numbers themselves refuse to be owned by one religion or another. Sheep are still sheep, whether counted by Oak Grove mystics or candlelit clerics. You can't help but laugh inwardly at the image of a pious monk scolding his flock for sin one moment, then scolding his flock of sheep the next. "One you missing, repent!" And yet, in a strange way, both acts overlap. Counting sheep remains ritual, a discipline, a meditation, and perhaps a quiet form of magic smuggled into the monastery under the guise of record keeping. As the druid rises to leave, the monk presses a hand against his shoulder. No words pass, but you feel the exchange. Gratitude, continuity, and maybe a sly acknowledgement that the old ways still hum beneath the surface of the new. You realise that whether on misty hillsides or in scriptorium halls, sheep counting endured, not erased, just translated. The druid steps back into the morning light, staff in hand, and you follow, hearing both the bleats of sheep and the distant chant of monks. Two traditions, one rhythm, and the same insistence that every sheep matters. By now the day is bright and the flock has sprawled lazily across the meadow, chewing their endless breakfast. The druid leans against his staff, watching them with a satisfaction that feels almost parental. You're about to tease him for being the ultimate helicopter parent when a group of children come running from the village. Their giggles carry on the wind, and before long you realise what they're doing, counting sheep out loud in sing-song voices. It's no longer ritual or courtroom evidence or festival tally, it's a game. The kids chase the sheep a little, pointing at each one, blurting out numbers in an old counting rhyme that sounds suspiciously like the shepherd's chants you've heard all night. Except here, the words are rounder, easier, strung into melody. It's less serious druid incantation and more bedtime story on legs. Mainstream historical fact: sheep counting numerals survived in children's rhymes and games across Britain into the modern period. Words like yan, tan, tethera were heard in playgrounds long after they stopped being used in pastures. And here's the quirky tidbit. By the 9th century, some kids were chanting these odd number rhymes while playing hide and seek, having no idea they came from ancient sheep counting traditions. Historians still argue whether the survival was unconscious cultural memory, or whether shepherd families deliberately passed the rhymes down as playful heritage. The druid watches Santanemo, and you sense a kind of pride in his expression. He knows the numbers are safe. Even if the rituals change, even if monks scribble Latin on parchment, even if raiders carry off half the flock, the counting lives on in the mouths of children. It's no longer just about keeping sheep alive. It's about keeping culture alive. Later that evening, you hear villagers repeating the same rhymes while drifting towards sleep. The cadence is softer now, almost whispered, like the closing of a lullaby. The link is unmistakable. The same rhythm that guarded sheep in the dark pastures now lulls people into dreams. You grin at the thought, parents across centuries whispering to restless kids, count sheep, And somewhere deep inside, the echo of Druid survives, reminding the modern world that something as silly and simple as numbers bleated into the night can still calm the mind. The Druid turns to you with a faint smirk, as if to say, "Told you it wasn't just about wool." You nod back, half amused, half amazed. Counting Sheep has leapt from sacred grove to bedtime pillow, carrying with it a story so old you can barely trace its beginning. The sun is low now, painting the meadow in honeyed light. The sheep, full from grazing, lie scattered like stones across the hillside, their breath slow, their bodies rising and falling in quiet rhythm. The Druid sits beside you, staff laid across his knees, and for the first time since nightfall, he doesn't murmur numbers. He only listens, to the hush of wind, to the gentle bleating, to the cadence that no longer needs his voice. You realise you've reached the end of the trail. From the first moonlit tally to this golden dusk, you've walked through a world where counting sheep wasn't metaphorical, wasn't silly, wasn't only for bedtime, it was literal, vital, sacred. It measured wealth, secured borders, invoked spells, mirrored the stars, structured festivals, and finally trickled into games and lullabies. Each bleat you heard carried echoes of law courts, bardic chants, fairy warnings, and monastic ledgers. And through it all the Druids stood steady, their voices the thread stitching wool to cosmos. Mainstream historical fact, the phrase counting sheep as a sleep aid only surfaces in European writing around the Middle Ages, centuries after Druids had faded into myth. And here's the quirky tidbit. Some scholars think the bedtime practice comes directly from shepherd traditions of murmuring numbers at night, a habit transformed into a universal trick for taming the restless mind. Historians still argue whether the leap from pasture to pillow was conscious folklore or just cultural osmosis, but either way, the connection is too neat to ignore. You lie back in the grass, watching the clouds drift like lazy sheep across the sky. For the first time you feel the rhythm settle into you, not frantic, not protective, not legal or magical, just calming. You count softly as your eyelids grow heavier. 1, 2, 3. The Druid smiles faintly as though seeing the cycle completed. His world slips into yours, and suddenly there's no gap between Iron Age pasture and modern bedroom. You probably won't survive life as a Celtic shepherd. You get lost in the mist or traded for a ram by accident, but you will survive tonight's story, and as you do, you carry with you the quiet truth that to count sheep is to touch the same ancient thread that once bound Druids, stars, flocks, and dreams together. So now, let your own thoughts drift the way those sheep drift across the field, slow, steady, unhurried. You don't need to count them sharply or carve notches in a staff or chant numbers with the weight of ritual. Just notice how each soft step of your mind feels like another woolly shape passing by. Gentle and unthreatening, one after another, without hurry, without struggle. The pasture quiets even more, the air heavy with warmth, and the flock lies still under a sky that is slowly filling with stars. Imagine yourself beneath that sky, wrapped in the same calm as the Druids once felt when their tally was complete, when every sheep was safe, when every number had been spoken. Nothing left undone, nothing left uncertain, only peace, certainty, and the comfort of repetition. Breathe deeply now, each breath a count, each exhale a letting go. If a thought strays, let it return like a wandering lamb, no need to chase it, no need to scold it. Just fold it back into the flock of your mind and keep counting softly until the numbers blur. The Druid fades into the background, the staff laid aside, the fires long extinguished. You are left with only the steady rhythm of breath, the softness of imagined wool, and the slow slide into sleep. Let yourself trust the count, trust the calm, trust the centuries of shepherds, bards, and monks who use the same rhythm to guide themselves into rest. You don't need to reach the end, you only need to begin and let the numbers carry you the rest of the way. Sleep is waiting.